So again, we're kind of limited on time, but in this first week, Ignatius sort of rounds up these conclusions with a meditation on hell, and then he gives us the option to, the director at least, he says, if the one giving the exercises judges that it be profitable for the exercitant, other exercises may be added here, for example, on death and other punishments of sin, etc., etc. Okay. So what we'll do then is we'll do sort of a combined last exercise. I want to go briefly through the points of the meditation or the contemplation of hell that he gives, as well as to talk a little bit about death. Okay? So the points on hell can be found on point 65, page 28. Page 28. And here Ignatius says, this is a meditation on hell. Besides the preparatory prayer and 2 preludes, it contains 5 points and a colloquy. Usual preparatory prayer. First prelude, he says, this is the representation of the place. Here it will be to see in imagination the length, breadth, and depth of hell. The second prelude, as we said, is always the desire. What are we asking for? And here Ignatius says, here will be to beg for a deep sense of the pain which the lost suffer. That if because of my faults I forget the love of the eternal Lord, at least fear of these punishments will keep me from falling into sin. Page 28. That's interesting, right? Because again, it's far, far better to love God and to not want to sin because we love him. But Ignatius says, yeah, but if what keeps me from sinning is the fear of hell, then hell has accomplished its purpose. Right? We said that too, like yesterday, talking about the scriptures. We said that, yeah, when we have that parable, when Jesus separates the sheep and the goats, and he tells the good, he's like, go on my right to the place prepared for you from all eternity, to go to heaven. And to the ones on the left, the ones who are condemned, he says, depart from me, you wicked, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Not prepared for you. That's not where I want you to go. But you earned it because of your actions. So then, in the points that follow, it's actually very straightforward what Ignatius says. He says, there's 5 points, but we also have 5 senses. And so Ignatius says, okay, with each sense, consider these things. He says, the first point, this will be to see in imagination the vast fires and the souls enclosed, as it were, in bodies of fire. See. The second point, to hear the wailing, the howling, cries, and blasphemies against Christ our Lord and against his saints. Third, with a sense of smell, to perceive the smoke, sulfur, filth, and corruption. Fourth, to taste the bitterness of tears, sadness, and remorse of conscience. And fifth, with a sense of touch, to feel the flames which envelop and burn the souls. So what is it? He just says, be there, feel everything, see the flames, hear the screams, smell the smoke, taste the bitterness of the tears, feel that fire. We should remember that Holy Mother Church has always taught that hell is a real possibility for people to end up in. The Catechism puts it this way. It says, we cannot be united with God unless we freely choose to love him. This is paragraph 1033 and through 1035. But we cannot love God if we sin gravely against him, against our neighbor, or against ourselves. To die in mortal sin without repenting and accepting God's merciful love means remaining separated from him forever by our own free choice. This state of definitive self-exclusion from communion with God and the blessed is called hell. And that's a very precise definition. Definitive, because it's not going to change. Self-exclusion. Self-exclusion. What does that mean? It's something I impose on myself. Sometimes people say like, well, how can God, who's so loving and so nice, throw people into hell? He doesn't throw anybody into hell. You throw yourself there. It's self-exclusion. And again, the point is not like, Ignatius says, no, I live my life in fear of hell. No. The point, that's a very low goal, right? Oh, I'm just so afraid of hell, I want to do what God asks. No. We want to love God and do what God asks because we love him. But, as Ignatius points out, he said, okay, if at some point I forget the love of God for me, at least remembering that there's a hell and that it's a possibility, hopefully that will keep me on the straight and narrow path. So what do the saints say about hell? Because sometimes this is the best sort of vision or understanding that we can have, right? And it helps us really to enter into what Ignatius is saying. So for instance, we have the servant of God, Sister Maria Josefa Menendez. She died at the age of 33. She was a mystic and she had a number of visions of hell. In fact, the sisters in her convent would know when she had had a vision of hell because they would go into the chapel and they could smell the sulfur. Yeah. And this is the way she describes one of her visions. She says, "My soul fell into abysmal depths, the bottom of which cannot be seen, for it is immense. Then I was pushed into one of those fiery cavities and pressed, as it seemed, between burning planks. And sharp nails and red-hot irons seemed to be piercing my flesh. I felt as if they were endeavoring to pull out my tongue, but could not. This torture reduced me to such agony that my very eyes seemed to be starting out of their sockets. I think this was because of the fire which burns. Not a fingernail escapes terrifying torments, and all the time one cannot move even a finger to gain some relief. Not change posture, for the body seems flattened out and yet doubled in two. A sickening stench asphyxiates and corrupts everything. It's like the burning of putrefied flesh mingled with tar and sulfur, a mix to which nothing on earth can be compared. Although these tortures were terrific, they would be bearable if the soul were at peace. But it suffers indescribably." And then she concludes this powerful vision with these words. She says, "All I have written is but a shadow of what the soul suffers, for no words can express such dire torment." Likewise, Saint Faustina, the saint of divine mercy, she also had visions of hell. And she writes at one point, she says, "I, Sister Faustina Kowalska, by the order of God, have visited the abysses of hell, so that I might tell souls about it and testify to its existence." And again, what I have written is but a pale shadow of the things I saw. But I noticed one thing, that most of the souls there are those who disbelieved that there is a hell. And then she goes through all of these different things, right? The loss of God, remorse of conscience, knowing that your condition is never going to change. And then she says too, there are special torments destined for particular souls. There are the torments of the senses. Each soul undergoes terrible and indescribable sufferings related to the manner in which it has sinned. There's also a famous vision of St. Teresa of Jesus. We don't have time to go through it, but she actually saw her place in hell, the place that was reserved for her. And it's a very powerful experience, right? I would add too, there's a vision that St. John Bosco had, if you're familiar with John Bosco, founder of the Salesians. And he was known for these dreams that he would have, right? And so one particular night, and it's a very lengthy dream that he goes through, and it's amazing because as he goes down and he sees this vision of hell, he sees children from his oratory running towards like this pit in the middle of hell. And he says, I was staring in bewilderment when a lad dashed out of the gate. Seemingly unaware of anything else, he emitted a most shrilling scream, like one who is about to fall into a cauldron of liquid bronze, and plummeted into the center of the cave. Instantly he too became incandescent and perfectly motionless, while the echo of his dying wail lingered for an instant more. Terribly frightened, I stared briefly at him for a while. He seemed to be one of my oratory boys. Isn't he so-and-so? I asked my guide. Yes, was the answer. Then he sees all these souls of these boys like frozen almost in this pit. And so then he says, more frightened than ever, I asked my guide, when these boys come dashing into this cave, don't they know where they are going? They surely do. They've been warned 1,000 times, but still they choose to rush into the fire because they do not detest sin and are loath to forsake it. Furthermore, they despise and reject God's incessant, merciful invitations to do penance. Thus provoked, divine justice harries them, hounds them, and goads them on, so they cannot halt until they reach this place. And the vision ends like in a very strange way, right? Because John Bosco and his guide are leaving hell. And so his guide makes this request. He says, but as soon as we stepped across the last bronze portal, he turned to me and said, now that you've seen what others suffer, you too must experience a touch of hell. No, no, I cried in terror. He kept insisting, but I kept refusing. Do not be afraid, he told me. Just try it. Touch this wall. I could not muster enough courage, and I tried to get away, but he held me back. Try it. Gripping my arm firmly, he pulled me to the wall and said, only one touch, so that you may say you have both seen and touched the walls of eternal suffering, and you may understand what the last wall must be like, if the first is so unendurable. Look at this wall. I did so intently. It seemed incredibly thick. There are 1,000 walls between this and the rear fire of hell, my guide continued. 1,000 walls encompass it, each 1,000 measures thick, and equally distant from the next one. Each measure is 1,000 miles. This wall is therefore millions and millions of miles from hell's real fire. It's just a remote rim of hell itself. When he said this, I instinctively pulled back, but he seized my hand, forced it open, and pressed it against the first of the 1,000 walls. The sensation was so utterly excruciating that I leapt back with a scream and found myself sitting up in my bed. My hand was stinging, and I kept rubbing it to ease the pain. When I got up this morning, I noticed that it was swollen. Having pressed my hand against the wall, though only in a dream, it felt so real that later, the skin of my palm peeled off. One of the Jesuit commentators on the exercises says that if our fear of hell ever wavers, if we're thinking nothing of the torments that are there, our ruin is assured. And again, it's not just thinking about these things that is enough for us, right? Some people may know the case of A.J. Ayer, who was a famous atheist, right? A-Y-E-R, Ayer. At some point, he suffered heart failure, right? And he had what was presumably an experience of hell. And he writes about it in an article, right? He says, "I was confronted by a red light, exceedingly bright, and also very painful even when I turned away from it." This is the atheist writing, and he says, "I was aware that this light was responsible for the government of the universe. And as time went on, I became more and more desperate until the experience suddenly came to an end. When he came back, they revived him." So in his article reflecting that, he ends with these words, right? He says, "My recent experiences have slightly weakened my conviction that my genuine death, which is due fairly soon, will be the end of me, although I continue to hope that it will be." And then he says, "These experiences, however, have not weakened my conviction that there is no God." Ayer died that same year, or that following year. That experience, which is presumably an experience of being judged of hell, did him no good. But hopefully the same will not be said of us. I also like to add, like Ignatius says, there's no meditation per se on death. But it's good, I think, to think about death and to remember what it entails and to say, like, okay, that's something that we're all awaiting, right? Sometimes hell is a little bit too, removed for us. You say, like, okay, yeah, well, whatever. I don't want to go to hell, so yeah, but all of us have to die. And so oftentimes when we think about it, it kind of sobers us up. So if you think about this, again, you can think, maybe if you've been to a hospital, you've seen a room where someone's died, or a funeral home. And if we're going to ask for a grace, it's going to be what? For a grace to regulate my life, to order my life, so that I can ensure a happy death. So what does death mean? Well, obviously it means separations. There's a lot of separations that go on. The soul from the body is the first one that comes to mind, right? And then what happens? The body decays, and it falls apart. Think of all the actors and actresses, all the supermodels who have died, right? All of that earthly beauty, and what happens after a few years? It's nothing. It's dust. That's what it turns to. But death also means a separation from the goods of this world. Right? The sort of earthly distinctions that we might like. We have our education, we have our skills, our families, money, savings account. But none of those things come with us. I don't know how many of you recall when the Habsburg royal family, right, is a big royal family in Europe, an important family. In 2011, I think it's the last time that one of the Otto von Habsburg died. And I think it's the last time one of their family members had the royal funeral. And so it's a very traditional ceremony. They have their mass, and then they carry the coffin to the Capuchin cloister in Vienna, because that's where the imperial crypt is. And so for centuries, they've had this tradition, this little rite that they do as they bring the coffin to the crypt, right? So they get to the door, like the cloister is oddly shut, right? And so the Grand Chamberlain, with his silver cane, knocks on the door. And from within, the Capuchin replies, he says, "Who desires entry?" And so they give, the name, Otto of Austria, and then they give all the things that he was in charge of, right? These hereditary titles. They say Otto of Austria once the Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary, Royal Prince of Hungary and Bohemia, of Croatia, Slavonia, Grand Duke of Tuscany and Krakow, Duke of Lorraine, and obviously these long-standing royal families, he has a ton of royal titles, right? And so finally, once they get done with his litany of royal titles, from inside the Capuchin replies, "We do not know him." And so the Chamberlain knocks again, and it's the same question: who desires entry? And then they reply with all of his sort of earthly honors that he's received. They say, well, Dr. Otto von Habsburg, he's the president and honorary president of the Pan-European Union, member and president of the European Parliament, honorary doctor of all these different universities, recipient of high civil honors, etc., and so forth. And again, from within, the prior replies, "We do not know him." So for a third time then, the Chamberlain knocks on the door, and a third time they ask from within, "Who desires entry?" And this time the Chamberlain replies, "Otto, a mortal and sinful man." And at that, the prior answers, "Then let him come in." They open the door, and he can be buried. In death, everybody's equal. You leave everything behind when you die. So what are some of the characteristics of death? Well, on the one hand, death is the most certain thing there is, right? Even in today's world where people say, well, like, if I don't see it, if I don't experience it, I don't believe it. But everybody believes they're going to die, right? People might want to escape it or delay it, put it off. But in the end, we know it's got to come. So in that sense, we can say death is the most certain thing there is. But death is also the most uncertain thing there is, because it's most uncertain as regards the circumstances. How, when, where, why. All of that is hidden to us. We don't know. Accident, disease, piece of space debris. I don't know. All of that is hidden to us. But to that truth, that the circumstances of death are mysterious and unknown, to that truth we can say there's one exception. There's one thing that we can predict with a pretty good degree of certainty. In fact, I would say almost infallibly we can predict this. And it's whether or not someone dies in a state of grace or in a state of sin. And why do we say that? Because it's like the old Latin saying, talis vita finis ita. As your life is, so will your end be. Talis vita finis ita. A case in point. Sorry if you've heard this story before, Radek and Daniel. But my first spiritual director went to go visit a woman who was dying and who refused to forgive her husband. I don't know what her husband had done, but she was on her deathbed. And so the priest kept insisting. He's like, you need to forgive your husband. She said, no, I can't. What he did was so terrible. And he said, look, you need to forgive your husband. You're dying. No. And the woman refused. And so finally the priest said, okay, look, if you don't forgive him, you will go to hell. And she replied, well, then I guess I'll see him there. And she died. Now, like, did that woman make the choice of a moment like that she wasn't going to forgive? No. That's a lifetime of unforgiveness. That's a lifetime of refusing grace. Sometimes people say, like, oh, well, I'll put off forgiveness until the end of my life. Okay, first off, you don't know when the end of your life is. Second of all, what makes you think that if you spend your time rejecting God's grace, that all of a sudden, at the end of your life, you're going to know when to accept it? if you want to die in friendship with God, then what do? We need to live in friendship with God. That moment of death is also the most decisive moment. Because all eternity depends on it. Sometimes people think of their, like the final illness when somebody's, terminally ill. They're like, oh, this is the beginning of the end. Nah, it's the end of the beginning. Life was the beginning, and the real life begins in eternity. You can make up for pretty much everything in this life. The one thing you can't make up for is a bad death. So what do we need to do? How do we prepare for death? Well, obviously we try to live each moment for God. We try to live each moment in the state of grace. We should try to receive Holy Communion often, right? They call it the pledge of eternal life. Sometimes in sacristies you'll see a sign that says, "Priest of God, celebrate this Mass as if it were your first Mass, your last Mass, and your only Mass." Imagine how we'd receive communion if that's the way we thought. Receive this communion as if it were your first communion, your last communion, and your only communion. Now, to conclude, right, this doesn't mean that we need to live in constant fear of death, right? Because really, if we're afraid of dying, the problem isn't with death. The problem is with us and the way we're living. You see this, for instance, in the lives of the saints. Because the saints saw death for what it was. It's just the passage from this life to eternal life. That's it. For instance, they tell the story of St. Alberto Hurtado, who was a Chilean Jesuit. And so he was very busy. He was a lawyer. He did a ton of things with the youth. He worked with the poor. He was very, very busy. So he noticed he was sick. He went to the hospital. He saw the doctor. The doctor did some tests. And he knew that St. Alberto had cancer. And he knew that he had a very short time to live. So he said, well, how do I break the news to Father Alberto? Like, how do you tell somebody, like, well, you're going to die soon? And so the doctor decided, he said, well, I'm just going to go and I'll just tell him. So he told him the truth. He said, look, you are very sick. You don't have a long time to live. Right? You're dying. And so Alberto didn't say anything. He just said, okay, can I borrow your phone? He said, sure. And so St. Alberto called his provincial superior, the one who was in charge of him. And as soon as he got a hold of him, a huge smile came on his face. And he said, Father, today is the happiest day of my life. They just told me that I'm going to die. Same thing, too, if you read A Story of a Soul, right, with St. Therese of Lisieux. She wakes up in the night coughing. She thinks that it's her tuberculosis that's getting bad. And she thinks that she's coughing up blood, meaning she's like at the end of her life. And so finally in the morning when she realizes that it's blood, when she realizes that like this is the first sign of her impending death, which will mean basically suffocating to death, she says, it was like a sweet and distant murmur announcing the arrival of the bridegroom. The sweet and distant murmur announcing the arrival of the bridegroom. In short, with these meditations, we can consider what St. Camillus de Lelis said. He's the founder of the Camillians. Once when he was going through, walking amongst the cemetery, like seeing the graves, he said, if these dead bodies could come back to life, they would do anything to gain eternal life. If these dead people could come back to life, they would do anything to make it into heaven. And he said, and I who now have the opportunity, what am I doing? You walk through the graveyard and you see all these headstones, all these people, and we don't know where they ended up. But you know for sure, like if they ended up in the fiery abyss, they would do anything to come back to life and set it right. And so what are we doing? We who have the opportunity. So we can make a colloquy then, at the end, maybe with St. Joseph, who's the patron saint of a happy death. With the Blessed Mother. And with Jesus on the cross, as he says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit.